Mi-Ai Parrish. I'm the head of ASU Media Enterprise, and I'm really excited to be here today with Ray Dalio to talk about his new book. It is another one of the soon-to-be best-selling books, I'm sure. This one is Principles for Understanding the Changing World Order, and he shares a template for understanding what's happening today and what is likely to happen. I'm excited about this practical look at history as a guide for us going forward, especially in such challenging times. Welcome, Ray. You are a man for all seasons, award-winning author and financial guru. How did you come to decide to do this particular study?
I've been a global macro investor for over 50 years. And one of the things I learned is that some of the things that surprised me with the most were things that never happened in my lifetime, but happened many times before. I learned that in 1971 when I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And the United States, on August 15th, President Nixon got on the television and he told the rest of the world that the gold that you're promised that the dollars are supposed to be converted into, you won't get. And there was a devaluation. I worked on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and I thought it was going to go down a lot, and it went up a lot. And I found the same thing happened on March 1933, with Roosevelt doing the same thing. And that taught me history repeats, but not necessarily in our lifetime. So three things are happening in our lifetimes that never happened before. And I saw that a few years ago, and I started to need to do that study. And those three things are the amount of creation of debt and the printing of money to monetize that debt, which is having its effects on inflation, on the value of money, on many things. The second is the amount of internal conflict that we're having. The conflict over wealth and values, the great polarity that has gotten to the point of having irreconcilable differences and threatening our system. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power and the existing world order. In other words, the rise of China. 1945, we created the existing world order that we're in, and that is being challenged. So that's what prompted me to study those things. And in order to do that, I had to study the last 500 years of history because these are big cycles. Thinking about the rise and decline of a reserve currency and its empires is a big cycle, and it was eye-opening. But I want to emphasize that though it's a big cycle, it comes down to help me understand what's going on right now with the Ukraine war, with the elections that are going to come up in the midterm elections, with the economy, and so on. So that's why I did it.
Many people would say it's unusual to have a global markets leader become a historian, essentially. You're a financial historian in some ways, and what do you think helps differentiate you to think that way and to approach this with this lens?
Paying the price of not doing it, learning the lessons, realizing that, like I said, I would not have been able to anticipate the 2008 financial crisis if I didn't study the Great Depression. So this is true. And this is one of the curses of our existence, is that we haven't been through wars before. Our generation has not had experiences before, right? Things that happen regularly. So experiences and painful experiences have taught me that I needed it.
Fall down 7 times, get up 8, but eventually you learn to try to learn. And we say frequently, those who don't study history or don't learn from history or doomed to repeat it, yet we keep doing that. How are you finding that your books are helping people in practical ways to really use that that history that is predicting, it is predictive of these big cycles.
Well, they're giving them the perspective and understanding of the mechanics, the cause-effect relationships. So, for example, we're going into an environment with this large creation of debt and printing of money, which is very much like going from the 1960s to the 1970s. What happens is people get used to an environment. There's a paradigm, and a paradigm is sort of a mindset. And so if you look at it, a decade, they often last about a decade. The 70s was an inflationary decade. The 80s was a disinflationary decade. And they start off with surprises because the decades are more opposite than similar to the prior decades. So, for example, we're coming into the mechanics of you create a lot of money and debt, and it's going to devalue it, and it's going to produce inflation. But there's not an inflation understanding. So there's a mentality, for example, that people think, well, what's safe is to keep my money in cash because it doesn't go up and down and it's safe. And they haven't yet learned that it's not safe because you lose buying power. And so if the inflation rate is 7% and you have a zero return, you just lost 7% buying power. So by helping people to understand those things, how the environments have changed and the cause-effect relationships and where we are in the middle of it has been very helpful. I did a video. There's a book that you mentioned, and then there's a video also by the same name, The Changing World Order. In 6 weeks, 10 million people have watched it. And it's an easy, animated, fun to watch video. And that video has brought so many compliments or expressions of appreciation for understanding the linkages. And it's free. So I've found the joy of being able to help people understand those linkages and where we are. And that's how it's happened.
That's fantastic. As you know, the McCain Institute and the Sedona Forum, so many great minds in this space, in global security and global finance, gather to talk about this. What would you want to make sure they hear from you about what you've learned in this study?
What makes a country healthy and successful? And one of the things I did was use measurements so that you can measure these things. And there's a cycle. And the cycle starts off with the basics. And usually there's an order. Okay. An order means a new system that comes into place. 1945, there's a war. The winners of the war get to determine the rules. That war can be an external war, it could be a civil war, but then the new power comes in and there's a new system. And the basics have got to be built. A
bit of a new storyline too.
New rulers,
yep.
A new system. Okay. And the basics start off with good quality civility with each other. Education is a leading indicator of everything. If you put education and civility and working together and not having the conflicts, that period usually after the war is a period of peace and prosperity also, because there's a dominant power. Nobody wants to fight the dominant power. And it's also, wars are great leveling devices. They reduce wealth gaps. They wipe out debts and so on. And so there's a cycle of that kind of improvement. But naturally, as things improve and living standards arise, wealth gaps widen, and also debts increase. And it's quite true for countries that have reserve currencies, because they're allowed to borrow from the rest of the world, because the rest of the world wants to save in that currency. And so quite often that cycle produces a lot more debt and larger wealth gaps. It also produces great inventiveness, but it also enters a new generation who haven't been through war, who might become maybe a little bit more decadent and not invest in infrastructure and education and the fundamentals that make things healthy. And as a result, you get larger wealth gaps and you get angry and you have more debt. And so a classic set of ingredients is that level of indebtedness and the and then losing the fundamentals. And of course, what happens is other competitors rise. So other countries after the war, Germany, Japan, they recover. China and other countries recover, and they become viable competitors in that. And so the power of that one dominant power ceases to be as dominant, and then there become more conflicts and so on. I'm answering your question in maybe too long a way, but I wanted to just help to convey that arc. So there are fundamentals. The fundamentals are basically, are you earning more than you're spending? Are you well educated and civil with each other? Are you productive? So are you competitive in the world? And so you can go from country to country right now and almost assess that. Those countries which are earning more than they're spending, that people are civil with each other and there's not internal order, and there's not a risk of an external conflict, are the ones that are best off.
You mentioned earlier about Ukraine and other current events that you have some predictions around, or there are aspects of that are predictable in the markets. What does that look like? What are you thinking about? What can we learn from history about what's going on today?
Well, the Ukrainian situation is part of a greater story, which is the world being bifurcated and not dominated by a single power. And you can see how it's lining up. You can see which countries, by their actions, are lining up which ways in this conflict. The United States, the NATO countries, as it pertains to the Ukraine, but not as it would pertain to Asia. And you could see China, Russia, and you could see actions by India, and so on, who is acting in what ways. And you will see that lineup be carried through in terms of things like, will there be a G20 meeting? And who will be on what side of the issues pertaining to that? So you're seeing this world polarity begin to line up. You're seeing questions, we'll see. This is like a test war. Many cases, in most cases in war, there's not a good understanding of how the actual war would take place. So it's very interesting when there is an actual war to take place to learn things, such as learning what the military power is and the possibility of escalating that war by Russia if Putin loses that war. Do they go to other escalated forms of conflict, such as nuclear? And also, it's a test of American sanctions. The greatest weapon the United States has, the only really unique weapon anymore, is the power of its economic sanctions. So the world is getting to see, will those sanctions work? Will they change the outcome? For example, what will be the economic consequences to Russia of those? Will that be a 10 or 12% decrease in GDP, which would mean not a very tolerable set of circumstances? And so we're learning. So three things I think we're learning at the moment. First, will Putin Putin and Russia win this war, and I'll define win the war as being able to have control of the southeastern part of the Ukraine and gain territory. That number two, that the impact on Russia is less than intolerable. In other words, it's tolerable. Number three, that he remains in power. If those things exist, then he would have a win. In other words, the cost of it would have been worth it. Mm-hmm. And so there's that question. The second question is, what will this mean for sanctions, the power of sanctions, and also the cost of sanctions? Because we have a cost in the form of holders of dollar-denominated assets in many countries are now nervous that they could be sanctioned. Will the Chinese, will the Indians, will the Middle Easterns, who might be sanctions? And that's having an effect on capital flows. So what we'll learn, what will that effect be? And then we will learn of how the sides line up. And that is really a lot of learning for what the next episode is going to look like.
Right. And do you have a sense, I'm not a student of history in the way that you are, certainly, but this feels a little different and a little uncertain, less predictable. And I think that has to do with the globalization that we've experienced and the rapid acceleration of our interconnectedness. How much of an effect does that have on your model, and how do you adapt for that?
Well, it's so interesting. If you were to watch these things happen, World War II, you'd see almost identical. In other words, you would see that Japan was sanctioned, a series of sanctions, mm-hmm. that the oil was embargoed, the assets were frozen, and they were trapped, in a sense, economically. And then they responded with Pearl Harbor. And you could see always economic warfare, intense like that, cut them off, is something that happens before there's a military conflict. It's almost like it reads the same. But it's true that over time, the world has become more interconnected. I mean, the first
it's harder to take sides in some ways, I think.
Well, it's interesting. The First World War. I mean, think about it. If you go back a few hundred years, it took a day. In a day, you could travel 25 miles. Today, in a day, you can be on the other side of the world. There's instant communications. So the First World War was the First World War. And the Second World War brought us more together, and it was the Second World War. And so then we are all connected, and that brings us in that position. History has shown, interestingly, that connections did not minimize the chances of war. In fact, for example, in World War I, in order to minimize the chances of wars, which was then run by royalties, they intermarried. And there was nothing closer than to be intermarried, and yet they went into World War I and so on. So I think the connectivity, and it also brings up other issues like that connectivity is literally cyber connectivity and so on, and it creates a dynamic. It means that there are less safe places in this world war. So it makes it, I think, very important that we don't get into a war.
Right. And you have so many lines of threats now that you didn't have in 1919, or, you just 1914. You didn't have the cyber attacks. You don't have the kind of disinformation campaigns and things that accelerate, particularly internal disorder, which is one of your points. And I'm really curious your thoughts on that internal disorder and what we're seeing and what you see ahead.
I was very lucky that I was born 1949 after I lived the American dream, you know. Um, I was there's not much you need really. You need parents who take care of you. I had a public education, and I came out to a world of equal opportunity, and I'm so grateful. And that's, by the way, one of John McCain. What John McCain represented to me was great character and bipartisanship. That's why I'm really here. And I know the difference. I think anybody who's seen it knows that today, how we are with each other is scaringly different. And it's measured in the statistics and the charts that are shown in my book. There is the greatest political polarity since 1900. And there's a real question of whether in the next election, either side will accept losing. There's a question about the acceptance of the rules. There is a moving to different states, not just for tax reasons, but for values differences, great differences. And there's much more fighting between the rich and the poor. But there are great differences, greater differences. My wife and I live in the state of Connecticut, and just to give you a picture, it's one of the three highest per capita on average income states, but it's a huge wealth gap. 22% of the high school students are disengaged or disconnected. Disengaged means that they have an absentee rate which is greater than 25%. And are failing classes. And disconnected means they don't even know where they are because they've dropped out. 1 in every 5 high school is failing. And there are gangs, there are drugs, and there are shootings. How can that happen in this great country? And so we're increasingly seeing now pockets of areas that are okay. And you're seeing this conflict take place. So I think that that's what's happening, how we are with each other. The idea of a Ronald Reagan and a Tip O'Neill sitting together over a couple of glasses of scotch and having the country's interest in mind as paramount ceases to exist. I mean, that's again why I went for John McCain. He was the only candidate that I've ever supported. And the reason I supported him is he was bipartisan and a man of good character. And we have lost that.
Can you imagine being able to have a John McCain and a Sam Nunn in the same way that we did in the 90s? Those sort of statesmen don't exist anymore. That kind of setup, that kind of creed almost that we shared about what makes a great civilization.
And if you see it in history, you understand that it's happened repeatedly for the same reason, because as the fragmentation causes populism, and populists are people who will fight for me. They won't compromise. They will fight for me. You get populists of the left and populists of the right who will only fight. And so you are seeing today in preparation for the 22 elections that a number of moderates have chosen to not run for re-election, and that in the primaries, you're seeing much greater extremism. And then when you come into the general election, you will have much greater extremism, and they will fight to win and not compromise. And so I don't think a John McCain can get elected today. And I don't think those people can be there today because of the nature of what's happened. And we've seen this in the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution or Civil War, the Cuban Civil War, that there are people in the middle that it starts off who say, we need to work things out and we need to find a way that's good. That a leader of the whole country. We don't have leaders for the whole country. You have a leader who is representing one side in a battle against the other side. And the polarity that exists has happened. It becomes always more and more intense until there is a war. We are in the early stages of a type of civil war.
Talk more about that. I agree with you. I and it's not funny in any way, but you see it, and the divisions. They're almost like alternate realities going on in the country today, which is very unfamiliar to me in my lifetime. What do you think is feeding that, and what do we do?
It is it's fed. It germinated by as populism germinates when you have people who are just angry that they want to be taken care of, and they may not be as cerebral as they are visceral, and they want to fight. And so you saw the move to populism with Donald Trump and the election from that, representing a population that felt that way. And then there's the opposing population. That's what goes on. And of course, once you cross a line, then there's a fight. When the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. And that's what we have.
I do want to make sure we touch on China, which is sort of the elephant in the room, as we're distracted, rightly so, by Ukraine and Russia and what's going on in Europe. But you are an expert at warning us about what's ahead, and China is a rising world power. What does that threat look like?
I've been going to China since 1984 closely. I've been able to participate in many ways in terms of the development. I know it intimately. I sent my son there when he was 11 to go to local schools and so on, and I know Chinese leaders, so I know it well. There is, to some extent, a destiny. Graham Allison wrote it well in his book, The Thucydides, about this Thucydides trap. It's called Destined for War. That it is inevitable, or almost inevitable, that when different powers arise and have different ways of doing things, that there can be a conflict about that. By and large, though, there's different cultures. The Chinese culture, if you study the dynasties in the history, with relationships to those outside, is kind of a tribute system. And both of the powers are very strong, comparable powers. And I think if they put the avoidance of a war together, that and drew red lines and dealt with that worst case scenario well, there's no reason for good coexistence. However, it's become a political issue in both places. And the reality of it right now is it's beyond talking, that the level of communication is almost non-existent. There was an idea of before finding common interests, climate change or whatever, and trying to work on that together. There's none of that. And there's just threats and counter threats. So that real picture is a very dangerous, scary real picture, particularly when it's taking place at the same time as we have the other two problems I mentioned, which is the financial problem. For example, the financial printing of money and so on will create inflation, and that'll create a political and social problem internally that makes people angrier. And that will make the internal conflict greater, and it'll also make populism probably stronger. And there are issues on both sides related to that. So it's the fact that
it's a global issue too. I mean, you're seeing that in France. It's not.
That's right.
It's not just us.
That's right. the fact that those three things are aligning that way, if you look at them in history, when they align that way, it's a very dangerous time. And I think that one of the reasons I wrote the book, and my number one message that I want to get across is, if you worry about these things, you don't have to worry, because the worry in and of itself of what could be should be something that allows you to deal with it. The world has more wealth than it has ever had, more technology, better sets of circumstances. If we are do the fundamentals right, most importantly, if we're good with each other and understanding, and we put that worst case scenario and at the top of the list as the worst case scenario, and deal in a bipartisan way, then we can deal with this. Like if I was president of the United States, by way of example, I'd probably have a bipartisan cabinet, and I probably would create something like a Manhattan Project, in which I brought together smart economic policymakers to find ways. I have my own ways of doing this. We each would do it in our own ways, but ways of both increasing the size of the pie and dividing it well so that people are productive and the pie does well. We have to have that bipartisan. We have to be in it together, not fight with each other. And you have to do it financially right. You have to get the country in a position where it earns more than it spends and doesn't destroy the finances the way it's now happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Ray, I could spend all day talking about this, but your time is valuable, and I want to thank you on behalf of the McCain Institute and the Sedona Forum for investing in sharing your wisdom to make us all a little bit more successful. I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I'm a great admirer of what the Sedona Forum is doing and how it came about. So thank you for letting me participate.
Absolutely. Thank you, and best wishes to you.
Thank you, and you too.